Commentary on Romans 3 1-8. Romans 3 1-8 serves as a bridge between Paul's exposure of humanity's failure and his proclamation of God's righteousness revealed through Jesus Christ. After showing that both Gentiles and Jews stand guilty before God, Paul anticipates objections from his Jewish audience. He answers their questions by pointing them away from confidence in ethnic privilege and toward the faithfulness of God. Romans 3 1-2. What advantage then hath the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? Much every way, chiefly because that unto them were committed the oracles of God. Paul has just argued that outward circumcision and possession of the law cannot make someone righteous before God. Naturally, this raises the question, was there any advantage to being Jewish? Paul answers with a definite yes. Israel was entrusted with God's oracles, the scriptures, covenants, promises, and prophetic revelation. They were the nation through whom God revealed his character and his plan for redemption. This privilege, however, was never meant to guarantee righteousness. It was a stewardship. The law and the prophets pointed beyond themselves to the coming Messiah. The history of Israel demonstrates God's unwavering commitment to his promises. Even when many in the nation failed, God's covenant purpose continued until its fulfillment in Christ. Romans 3, verse 3-4. For what if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? God forbid. Israel's unbelief could not cancel God's faithfulness. Throughout the Old Testament, God repeatedly encountered rebellion from his covenant people. Yet he remained true to his word. His promises depended upon his character rather than human performance. Paul quotes Psalm 51, verse 4, where David acknowledges God's righteousness even in the midst of human sin. God's faithfulness reaches its climax in Jesus Christ. Though many rejected him, God's redemptive plan was accomplished exactly as promised. The rejection of the Messiah by many in Israel did not defeat God's purpose. It became part of the means by which salvation was proclaimed to the nations. The destruction of Jerusalem and the passing away of the Old Covenant order demonstrated that God's warnings were as certain as his promises. His word proved true in both judgment and redemption. Romans 3, 5, 6. But if our unrighteousness commend the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unrighteous who taketh vengeance? Paul introduces another objection. Someone might argue, if human sin highlights God's righteousness, then why should God judge sin at all? Paul rejects this reasoning. God's righteousness is not dependent upon evil. Human rebellion may reveal God's justice and mercy, but it never excuses rebellion itself. God remains the righteous judge because his judgments are perfectly just. The covenant judgments that came upon Israel vindicated God's holiness and confirmed his faithfulness to everything he had spoken through the prophets. The coming judgment upon the Old Covenant world was not arbitrary. It was the fulfillment of long-standing covenant warnings given through Moses and the prophets. Romans 3, verse 7-8. For if the truth of God hath more abounded through my lie unto his glory, why yet am I also judged as a sinner? Paul addresses a distortion of his message. His opponents apparently accused him of teaching that evil should be encouraged because God can bring good out of it. Paul summarizes the accusation. Let us do evil, that good may come. He firmly rejects such thinking. God's grace does not celebrate sin. It triumphs over it. The good news is not that sin becomes acceptable, but that God has acted decisively in Christ to deal with sin and reconcile humanity to himself. Paul's critics misunderstood the message of grace because they viewed God's favor through the lens of human merit. Paul insists that God's righteousness is a gift, but that gift does not make evil good. The condemnation of those who deliberately twist the message is just because they misrepresent God's character and purpose. The larger theme, Romans 3, verse 1-8, reveals several important truths. God's faithfulness never fails. Human unbelief cannot overturn God's promises. From Abraham to Christ and through the fulfillment of God's covenant purposes, he remains true to his word. Privilege does not equal righteousness. Israel possessed extraordinary blessings, but those blessings pointed to Christ rather than serving as a substitute for faith. God's judgments are righteous. The covenant judgments spoken by the prophets and fulfilled in history demonstrate that God faithfully keeps both his promises and his warnings. Grace is not permission for sin. The gospel announces God's victory over sin through Christ. It is not a license for wrongdoing, but the revelation of God's righteousness apart from human achievement. Christ at the center. Romans 3, verse 1 to 8, prepares the reader for Paul's great declaration that follows. The question is not whether Jews or Gentiles have performed well enough to earn God's favor. The question is whether God has remained faithful to his promises. Paul's answer is an emphatic yes. Israel's story, humanity's failure, and God's covenant dealings all find their fulfillment in Jesus Christ. God's righteousness has been revealed, his promises have been kept, and his faithfulness has been vindicated. The Old Covenant age reached its appointed conclusion. The Messiah accomplished redemption, and the truth of God stands forever despite the unfaithfulness of humanity. Paul's message is that the believer's confidence rests not in human faithfulness, but in the unchanging faithfulness of God, who has fulfilled his saving purpose in Christ and established a righteousness that cannot be overturned by human failure.